talk a little bit about carrying capacity, at least as far as it relates to forest recreation management. So, the basic idea of carrying capacity got its start in kind of the first half of the 20th century with this guy Aldo Leopold and his fairly close relative A. Starker Leopold that kind of elaborated on the idea. So, the basic sense of carrying capacity is the following. You have some area. Maybe it's an ecosystem, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's some ecotone or interface between various ecosystems. And each of these ecosystems, let's say one of them is a sort of heavily forested ecosystem, we'll represent that in green on the left. And then maybe we've got more of an aquatic ecosystem represented in blue on the right. So let's say this area is some kind of a pond or a lake, and it's got a forested ecosystem attached to it, and there's some interface where there's saturated soil, and above the water table resources and below the water table resources, we'll call that shoreline or beach or what have you. So the basic idea of carrying capacity that most people understand is the original idea of carrying capacity. That is, what is a place's ability to sustain populations of various species? And if you sit down and think about it, that's a pretty useful thing. So if we have some number of carrying capacity in mind for a place, let's say it's a big pasture or this forested plus aquatic or freshwater ecosystem pair, whatever it is, if we have that particular species in some population number way above the carrying capacity, we can understand just right on the face of it that bad things are going to happen. There's not going to be enough food to go around. But there also might be other follow-on effects like population genetic degradation based on starvation if there's not enough food. There might also be other kinds of deficits like cover habitat, mating habitat, rearing habitat, migration corridors. They might be overwhelmed. And so the basic idea of, well, carrying capacity at the face of it is that there's some number that describes how many of a given species a place can support kind of indefinitely or long term. Now, it gets a little bit more complex when we consider that sometimes we have El Nino or La Nina climate cycles that make for wetter or drier climates, that make for more or less food or water availability, better or worse cover, mating, rearing, etc. habitat. So, what we're talking about here is really only one of 4 different kinds of carrying capacity. First, we have that biological carrying capacity. And with that, we have all of what we just talked about. The dynamics of a species population over time, fluctuating higher and lower, and some carrying capacity number. So on this graph of time versus population size, our dashed line here represents some imaginary number of, let's say, 1,000 elk in a certain area. And when we get above that line, then the habitat cannot support 1,100 elk or 1,100 elk, so the population declines a little bit. Maybe it drops below that carrying capacity. And since the carrying capacity can support more than, let's say, 900 elk after that population dips, it goes back up. And we see this sort of oscillation or this wavy effect on the population level over time as it, at least in theoretical models, tends to home in around that carrying capacity value and just wavers slightly above and slightly below it. We call this dynamic equilibrium. And this is a useful concept, but remember, nature is not static. It's never standing still. So we're always going to be a little bit above, we're always going to be a little bit below. And this carrying capacity line, which I've represented as a flat or straight or constant numeric value line on our little graph here, well, that doesn't actually stay static either. So some years we're going to have more or fewer elk. Some years we're going to have a higher or lower biological carrying capacity, just based again on things like weather or illness or disease working its way through, or what have you. Again, biological carrying capacity is only one of actually 4 different kinds of carrying capacity. The second, useful for recreation management, because we're also dealing with the human wildlife species, if you want to think of it that way, is physical carrying capacity. Humans love to go to places that are unique and beautiful and exceptional and, well, sometimes frankly kind of small, like the top of a mountain. The actual peak of a mountain is mathematically infinitesimally small. It's that one little spot on one rock that happens to be the highest around everything nearby. Cliff edges are lots of fun for recreation, specifically rock climbing and nature viewing and so forth. They're also kind of dangerous. So, forest recreation managers like park rangers and so forth have to take into account the physical carrying capacity, which is defined as the number of humans the area can physically contain. We see examples of physical carrying capacity management at places like Ozark National Scenic Riverways, not too far from SIU. And the idea here is that we have this beautiful riverine system where lots and lots of visitors like to go tubing and so forth. And so we have people in the water having a great time in tubes. That's this sort of donut shape around the waist of this fellow. And you float down the river, maybe you have a couple of brews, maybe you are there with a couple of friends, and you have a really good time, want to come back the next year. Maybe bring some more friends, maybe bring some family members, maybe stay a little bit longer. Well, in certain places, as it turns out, on Ozark National Scenic Riverways, even though that particular national park represents 168 miles of total river length, that's a lot of river. Well, think of that river as a finite ribbon of space. So there's 168 miles of length, and at any given point, the river is a certain width. And of course, multiplying length by width, so 168 miles times 5,280 feet per mile times the width. Let's say the width in a particular place is 100 feet. Let's say that's the average width across the whole section of river that we're concerned with. That gives you some particular value of, let's see here, pull out my calculator, 168 times 5,280 times 100 feet gives us 88,704,000 square feet. Now that's a lot of space in which to stick these tubers and rafters and kayakers and canoers and motorboatists like John boat and bass boat users. There's a lot of river for everybody, but in certain places, as it turns out, the places that people like to go best, instead of just randomly, evenly distributing out across the river, that use can kind of pile up. And in places like Ozark Scenic Riverways, which might see hundreds of thousands of visits a year, and a lot of those visits happening all at the same time during those hot summer months when tubing is lots of fun, you can imagine a situation where specific spots on the river, especially where the river narrows, and it's easier to access than other more remote sections, well, the river actually has reached in the past physical carrying capacity where you just can't fit through the clot of people trying to tube on downriver. Now imagine you're a park ranger and you have some difficulty getting to somebody who is a little bit downriver of these folks, and the river ramp or put-in is upstream of these folks, and you got to get to this person down here because they are having a heart attack. So you're doing search and rescue mode for somebody who's been reported to be in very bad condition, and you can't safely get your boat through this set of people who are literally, in some cases, stretched from bank to bank. Hundreds of people at a time in some cases. This is a problem. So, physical carrying capacity is a big deal. The third kind of carrying capacity is social carrying capacity. The idea with social carrying capacity is, well, for any particular place, including a river, but also spots like mountain summits, we want to be up there. We get some pretty cool stories for the gram and Facebook and WhatsApp or TikTok if you really enjoy the Chinese government, whatever your jam is. Social carrying capacity is an expression of what feels appropriate to the number of people in a certain square area. So maybe meters squared versus the people at one time, or the people you can see at one time, called the people per viewshed. People at one time versus people per viewshed. Related numbers, but not the same thing. Imagine dividing the number of people you can see at one time, let's say, versus the area in which they are occupying. Like this mountain summit. That gives us a certain use density, or people visible per square meter or per square kilometer. Whatever the units are, doesn't particularly matter. At some level, a low use density means that you are basically in a pretty good situation where you've got the place all to yourself. And a high use density is the inverse, where you have to share that limited space, that beautiful mountain summit with the gorgeous views of maybe sand dunes far away, maybe the ocean out beyond that, whatever. You gotta share that with lots of other people. And that can change an objective use level number or density into a subjective sense of crowding. So there's been a lot of research done over the years at various national parks, some of which get super busy, like Yellowstone, Grand Teton, Haleakala National Park, Acadia National Park, the U.S. National Mall, which is run by the U.S. National Park Service, and so on and so on and so on. A lot of these places see up to a couple of million visitors a year. Some of them see a lot more than that. Great Smoky Mountains National Park sees over 6 million visitors a year. Depending on how you count them, the National Mall sees over 10 million visitors a year. So, we have this objective just number of people present, and then we have a subjective evaluation of that objective use level. That's crowding. And if the crowding is over some kind of tipping point number, people all of a sudden go from, ooh, I'm having a blast, to, gosh, I feel like I'm in a crowded theme park and I'm not having any fun anymore. I'm dealing with everybody else instead of enjoying my beautiful mountain summit, or wherever you are. So, social carrying capacity is an expression of both the use density, which is just an objective number, and the subjective way that people feel about that use density. We call that crowding when it's a negative evaluation. Now, I mentioned that there are 4 different kinds of carrying capacity that we care about in forest recreation management. Here's the 4th and final. This one's a little bit different than the previous 3. The previous 3 we can express as a number or a density. Like biological carrying capacity is number of elk per square kilometer, or number of eastern black bears per square mile, or whatever. Physical carrying capacity, much the same. Traffic engineers worry about number of vehicles per linear meter of road, or number of people on each square meter of sidewalk, believe it or not. We have this whole manual on what's appropriate for sidewalks. And similarly, again, crowding is a density number and an evaluation of that density number. The fourth and final kind of carrying capacity is basically what kind of capacity, like what ability do you as the park ranger or you as the park superintendent or recreation assistant or technician or specialist or whatever, what kind of organizational capacity, what kind of will do you have, what kind of skills do you have available to you to get the other three carrying capacities in order? We call this managerial carrying capacity. Okay? And this is your resources, including and mostly human resources, in terms of things like skill sets. What equipment do you have? You can modify physical carrying capacity using equipment. You build more miles of trails if your trails are too crowded and spread out use among them. Well, that works up to a point, and then you get into diminishing returns. So, if it helps, think about carrying capacity a little bit like a diagram like this, with managerial carrying capacity binding together the other three, and the other three each influencing the others. Okay, so again, the classical biological carrying capacity, that influences the physical carrying capacity. In a vigorously growing jungle, for example, the physical carrying capacity for people is relatively low because so much of that space is occupied by vigorously growing vegetation. Okay? And so physical carrying capacity also influences biological carrying capacity. Think about a cave system with a very, very sensitive or fragile cave ecosystem. Well, there's only so many miles or so many cubic meters of cave gallery or cave stream in which the biological members of that community can live. And so it's just a precious resource to have the space to be able to look for food safely without getting predated upon. Okay. Social carrying capacity, of course, is deeply dependent on the other three. So, you might not feel crowded with 100 other people nearby on a busy sidewalk in front of a visitor center at Yosemite National Park, because you kind of expect a lot of people to be around a busy visitor center at Yosemite National Park. So the physical carrying capacity there might be the same as a cliffline trail right about the size or width of that same sidewalk, maybe 3 or 4 feet wide total, but running along a sheer cliff with a 1,000-foot drop on one side and an unscalable smooth granite cliff face to your other side. That feels different, even though the physical number is the same. So the social carrying capacity on that cliff edge trail might feel pretty different. Like if anybody is crowded onto your space on that cliff edge trail while you're trying to be safe and not fall off, well, maybe they're the same distance they would be on a regular sidewalk, but it just feels really inappropriate, maybe even downright dangerous. Okay, so social and physical carrying capacity affect each other. Social and biological carrying capacity affect each other in the following way. What about the Endangered Species Act? When visitors understand that they're in the habitat or near the habitat for an endangered, rare, or threatened species, that changes their understanding of how many people are socially appropriate to be in that spot relative to how people are behaving. So the managerial carrying capacity in this case is to educate people about their human effects on the fragile or maybe heavily taxed biological carrying capacity for a species that's just trying to come back from the brink of extinction. So, 4 different kinds of carrying capacity, each interrelated to and affecting all of the others.